No break.
Keep going. No breaks.
We
keep going.
No
it
rest for the wicked. I like it.
Yeah, no rest for the wicked. We're going to do this the way we have done this in the past.
I like it. We're getting used to the way we're doing things now, but that's all right. It's
so on this map you can see the tip of Tinian. JP, if you'll go to that next map, we'll show both islands. The two islands are very, very close. As you can see from that map, and there's Tinian. So we would eventually do airfields at both Tinian and Saipan. It would be the 20th Air Force. The 20th Air Force had been created solely for the purpose of flying B-29 bombers to attack Japan, and this invasion was solely done to create air bases for them, because at the time we had not secured, the Philippines hadn't even been invaded yet. Wouldn't be invaded for several more months.
MacArthur had not returned.
MacArthur had not quite returned yet. Now, Guam, which is part of this chain, is just south, so it's just below the bottom of the map, and they would also build bases to fly from there. And of course, this would lead to the story of why we took Iwo Jima, because it was a place for the crippled bombers on their return to land, but it was also a place we could launch P-51s to fly air support. So that was the purpose behind the whole battle. And
now,
we're going to...
Got a question for you, since you mentioned P-51. Unquestionably the most significantly well-known aircraft of World War II. And probably, I would say, the only aircraft that a modern pilot today would say, you know what, I would still fly that, because it's the sexiest plane probably ever created.
Sexiest airplane ever.
Hands down. So, I think even some of our Air Force fighter jocks would say, yeah, if I had the opportunity to fly one of those, I would.
Oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
It was... How did that compare to the Japanese Zero?
Light years more superior. Sorry, I'm turning off my reminder here, and it's not going very well.
I'll talk about it.
I'm like, where's the music coming from?
We got a little Jimmy Buffett going on.
I didn't push the button.
That's okay. Jimmy Buffett, all right? If we're talking about, great guys that veterans would love to just chill out, hang with.
Yeah, it would be Jimmy Buffett. But no, the P-51 significantly, it outclassed, until the Me-262 came along, it literally outclassed everything. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know what is happening here.
Because the P-51 was ultimately the predecessor to what ultimately is now the A-10. Because the first mission of the P-51 was to be a tank destroyer.
Actually, believe it or not, the tank destroyer, the best-known tank destroyer, was the P-47, the Jug.
But in Europe, they used the P-51 Mustangs to knock out tanks. That was one of their...
Again, more often they would use the P-47s, because what they would do would be to mount... They'd take the 650 caliber machine guns out, and they'd mount 20-millimeter cannons under the wings.
Nice.
Yeah. But yes, the P-51 was an incredible plane. It would see service in Korea. It would actually shoot down a MiG-17.
Really?
Although that didn't happen very often.
I was going to say, speed and all that, and altitude.
And again, in our famous tangents, I'm going to go back to telling another story about an autographed copy of a book I have.
Oh, God. The Library of Congress, is starting, we do know a few members of Congress, between us.
Yeah.
You're making them kind of...
So the gentleman's name was James Howard, and he had originally started the war flying for the American volunteer...
The Flying Tigers.
The Flying Tigers, and it was the AAV, and I'm trying to remember what AAV stood for. But they were volunteers.
I know the volunteers.
But they were the volunteers. They were the famous Flying Tigers flying P-40s. All of them were called back once we declared war, which, much to Chiang Kai-shek's...
Chennault was the...
Chennault was in charge. General Chennault.
And Pappy Boyington.
Pappy Boyington flew with them for a while.
We need to do a show just on the Flying Tigers, I'm thinking.
It's another great topic.
Oh,
But James Howard was assigned to fly in Europe, and he was assigned to fly P-51s. But he is significant because one of the other things we love to talk about on this show are our Medal of Honor recipients. And he would become the only P-51 Medal of Honor recipient. to come out of, to ever, because there was not one in the Korean War.
Did not
So
know that.
anyway, let's talk about another gentleman. So let's go back to the battle map right quick, because I want to talk about this. This was an absolutely, the Japanese were brutal and they were cruel, but you had to admire their dedication. And this gentleman really epitomized more of an American-style dedication to the mission. So I mentioned the Banzai Charge, which occurred, and it's right dead center in the island. If you can see where it says Death Valley, that mountain is the highest point on the island. It was littered with caves, and there was a general by the name of s2e14. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. My
I believe you are.
apologies.
I'm almost trying to remember hearing that name.
So this battle ended on 9 July 1944. It would be 512 days before the man that would become known as the Fox, who was a Japanese captain who had fought in China, so I'm sure he was probably guilty of doing some bad things, and then would be part of it. He was actually stuck. His ship was torpedoed. Now, this guy had a wild war. He had some stories to tell. He was rescued. He was dropped off on Saipan. They didn't have room on the ship that was going back to take him back to Japan to be reassigned. So he stayed there, and he commanded a medical unit, but he was in charge of it. He was not a doctor per se. So as they were doing the Banzai Charge, he and about 100 other, he and about 20 other Japanese soldiers basically get cut off. It's at night. And they realize that the battle is over. And so he starts heading back to the mountains because he is going to continue to fight. And he would continue to fight until the 1st of December, 1945, 3 months after World War II ended.
That's right. I do remember. That's where I knew the name. You know,
And there's actually a book that was written about him by an American who was on Saipan called The Last Samurai. And when he finally surrendered, let me finish the first part of the story. He would eventually collect 100 Japanese soldiers and over 200 civilians. And at one point, one of the commanders desperately trying to find this guy, literally lined soldiers up 2 meters apart on a width of about 1.5 miles and marched up the island trying to find him, and they walked right past his cave. That was up in this Mount
dense
Tapachu.
jungle.
But very, very dense jungle, extremely dense jungle. I can imagine this being American volunteer groups. What are we trying to find? We're changing the subject on me.
That's your Flying Tigers volunteer group you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I know what it is. It just has nothing to do with the current story.
But hey, he's helping us out. You know,
He's trying to help
Well,
us
you guys
out.
couldn't think about it, so I was
JP,
trying to help you.
Thank you. I
There we
like
go.
that.
Hey,
You know,
there we go.
That's a knowledge bomb or
That-
something.
Yeah, it's
Definitely.
another tangent. But I can still remember my story. So anyway, the nickname, the Fox. He would obviously be returned to Japan. They interrogate him, but he would, in those 512 days that he conducted guerrilla operations. And there are several fascinating books about the Americans who did the same thing on the Philippines. Some incredible books. In fact, there's an entire fictional account.
Well, the Apache Scouts and some of those guys over there.
The Filipino Scouts, the multiple members of different, usually as onesies and twosies, they got started, but they would eventually find each other. And it's absolutely the fascinating part of these stories. But can you imagine being in the jungle and conducting guerrilla operations, and they survived by stealing American rations?
Small unit tactics can do a
Absolutely.
whole lot of damage. And do you know who was our father of small guerrilla tactics? Robert's Rangers, the only American general that was complete.
Back in the American Revolution.
Was undefeated, and his only military regret was he never got to fight side by side by Washington.
So I thought you were going to talk a little bit about the OSS, and I will share the story that I've actually been through the OSS. That is yet another show. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to honor the Fox because you think about it, and even though, yes, he did a lot of damage, one of the things, because a lot of his soldiers wanted to stand and fight that one final battle, and he said, no, our calling is to protect our civilians. In fact, at one point when he was almost captured, the older and more infirmed civilians volunteered to stay behind,
right,
so that they would be captured. They would delay the Americans long enough, and they didn't fight. They just were like, okay, yeah, we're here, but the Americans, not knowing what they had to stop. And it was a delaying tactic to let him get away. Extremely well respected. He would go back to Japan. He would become a successful businessman and then eventually become city councilman in the city that he was from. So, quick sidebar, when he did surrender, he did so with great dignity, and he presented a lieutenant colonel of the Army with his samurai sword.
Really? Wow. That's quite an honor.
That was considered quite an honor, and that lieutenant colonel kept that sword. But the story became, I mentioned there was a book written about him, The Last Samurai. The author of the book found the lieutenant colonel and asked him if he would return the sword. And by this time, the lieutenant colonel was old enough that he didn't want to travel to Japan. Right. But the author took the sword and, again, with great ceremony, returned it to the family, where today it is an honored part of the family. So let's go back to the bigger strategic picture.
Okay.
The 20th Air Force was created for the sole purpose of flying B-29s and dropping big bombs on little people, and they did that with great devastating effect.
Yes,
and
they
let's
did.
go to the next pictures. But the greatest effect occurred when and here we see, this is the entire strategic purpose of taking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, because we when you look at them, other than that, they have no strategic importance. But they were the closest islands, and I was talking about egos. There was a debate whether we should take the Philippines or take Taiwan, because once we had taken Taiwan, we'd effectively isolated the Philippines.
Yep.
And there wasn't much they would have been able to do. But MacArthur wanted to go to the Philippines.
And do you know why he wanted the Philippines?
Yeah, because he said he was going to return.
Well,
MacArthur had been, and his father before him had been the governor of the Philippines.
They owned property almost half of the Philippines at the time. It wasn't so much for military purposes. It was for business.
Yeah.
It wasn't personal. It was business.
A lot of our listeners may or may not know the name, the Enola Gay.
Yep.
And this was the sad thing, is the Japanese had no intention, even with massive firebombing, of surrendering. In fact, the firebombings of Tokyo took twice as many lives as both atomic bombs combined.
And do you know why? Also, part of the reason why, and it had a lot to do with one man, the emperor. What did the Japanese did not view the emperor as human? He was a god, and they were not allowed to even look at him.
Yep.
So much so, when he would ride, they could only see the bottom of the white horse, his feet. They were not allowed to look at him.
Let's throw up that picture of the Enola Gay as we're about to roll into the end of this show.
Right.
But it was from, there we go. There's pictures of the Enola Gay popping up. And their crew.
Colonel Tibbets.
And yes, indeed, Colonel Tibbets loved that. But even the first atomic bomb did not bring the Japanese to their knees.
Did not.
It was the second atomic bomb. And here's the thing: the historians who say, "Oh, we shouldn't have dropped the bomb." Yeah, we absolutely should have.
What was the name of the aircraft that dropped the second one?
Fifi. So we're just about out of time.
Right.
We'll have another discussion, but it's a simple math problem why we dropped the bomb. They said that the U.S. would incur at least 250 casualties.
And
the Japanese would have incurred over 1 million. All in, 2 atomic bombs only took 175,000 lives. I know it was horrific. I know it was terrible, but that's a simple math problem.
Yep. Here's the thing about Colonel Tibbet, though.
Quick tidbit is
about Tibbet. I actually served with one of his grandchildren,
Wow.
and where he's buried. Do you know where he's buried?
No. Is there a book about it that I need to put in my library?
You probably could, but he is buried here in Texas
Yeah.
in an unmarked grave.
Wow.
He did not want, because he knew the significance of what this event was.
Oh.
He did not want controversy to follow him in his train. So he is actually buried in an unmarked grave, not in a U.S. veteran cemetery. He's in a country grave somewhere that...
In many ways, it's sad that we cannot honor a man who
did not want
so much for this country.
that, type thing. So,
Because some of the idiots out there would definitely have desecrated his gravesite. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we come to the end of another show. I can't believe how little information I had prepared and how far we stretched it.
Yep, and it is always fun out here dropping knowledge, on everyone over here. So our knowledge warheads on foreheads.
The warheads on foreheads, baby.
To another end. So make sure you tune in to next week's show. We will be dropping more knowledge on you all. For Chuck and I, this hoorah, hoorah, happy Army birthday, happy Corps of Army Engineer birthday, and see you all next week.
All right.
We're out. That was fun. I liked it. Yeah, there's a bunch of little cool history. When
I was just trying to keep, get you guys the information. We don't know what it means. Well, okay, well, here you go.
I don't mind.
That's okay. I heard it wrong. I heard AAV, and I'm looking up AAV, and I'm finding viruses. So, but hey, what a great show, though.
The ball